todas las danzas son del noroeste de África. Nosotros elegimos esa región porque nos dimos cuenta a través del internet que los esclavos que fueron extraídos de allá llegaron hasta acá, a nuestro pueblo, a Collantes, y entonces empezamos a indagar y retomamos.
All right, peace everyone. Welcome back to the Dark Warrior Perspective channel. And once again, I want to bring to you another Darks edition article reading. As promised, I was going to give to you guys this reading on a weekly basis. So let's go ahead and get right to it, to the meat and potatoes of it. Um, I want to give you guys heads up. I do not speak Spanish. I don't speak Aztec. I don't speak Mayan. So there are some words in this article that I'm going to have difficulty pronouncing. But please forgive me on the mispronunciation of it, and just focus on the meat and potatoes of the article. Because after the article reading, I'm also going to give you more information, book reference, and other readings in which I've disseminated my information to support the article in which you're about to hear. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop procrastinating and get right to it. As you can see, I went back to one of my famous articles, the Negro Digest. This particular subject matter has been on my mind for the last few years. I did a video on the Afro Brazilians. You should already have either seen that, and if you're new to the channel, please go back to the channel and watch a brief bit of history of the Afro Brazilians, the African influence there by way of the transatlantic slave trade. So I wanted to hone in on the segment of the African population in Mexico, and I was reading this particular article in the Negro Digest dated August 1965 by the Johnson publication. And the title of the article is "The Negro Republic in Modern Mexico." Is talking about the Afro Mexicans, a segment in which we really need to um, learn more about, and that's what we're here to do today. All right, so let's just get right to it. We're going to go here. We're going to scroll down. As you can see, it's on page 14. All right, and I'm going to increase it as usual so you guys can see this and you can read along with me. Okay. All right, so as we scroll right here, we're on page 14, and you can see the map. So you see off of the Gulf of Mexico, you have the Caribbean Sea over here. You got Central America. And you have Mexico right here right on the border of the United States. All right. So if you look closely here, this is much of the population which they were bringing a lot of Africans. You have Cuba over here, all right, and you have over further to your right Haiti and things of that nature. All right, so when we scroll down, let's go ahead and begin reading this article. Let me kind of pan out a little bit so you can get the gist of it. So you have the Black Republic in modern Mexico, the Afro Mexicans, and it was written by a man by the name of Jim Tuck. He was a Princeton graduate who has studied this subject matter for some time. He's not the only one. There's been other people. We're going to get to those historians in just one bit. So the article begins: the descendants of slaves who escaped from the United States inhabited an area near famed Acapulco. To say that Mexico is a land of wonders, artistic, archaeological, and scenic, is an obvious truism. There live few with souls so dead who have not thrilled to an Orozco mural, the antiquity of Chichen Itza, or the surreal beauty of Papacapatua by moonlight. With its art, history, and cultural heritage, Mexico is a land that fairly begs for a traditional lost civilization, a la James Hilton. And the writer has encountered more than one American who has gone home regretting that the Mexican catalog of wonders were more one of objects than of persons. You have ruins, paintings, and volcanoes are fine, but let's face it, there is nothing that grips the popular imagination like the promise of a community of lost humans surviving a remote Shangri-La or Shangri-La. Well, I have news. There does exist in Mexico a lost, or to put it more accurately, completely overlooked civilization, a culture so antithetical, so alien, and so different from anything Americans associated with Mexico that it seems like an importation from another continent and other world. Its members are not, as might be supposed, descendants of Aztecs or Mayans undiscovered by conquistadors and living as they did in Montezuma days. They are rather people of pure Negro stock who presently inhabit a region of Mexico that resembles the land of their origin and topography, climate, and, as we shall see, many other respects. Where does all of this fit into the traditional ethnic concept of Mexico as an Indo Spanish country as opposed to, say, Cuba or Dominican Republic, where the ethnic strain is Afro Spanish? The answer is simply that the traditional view is absolutely correct, and Mexico is a Spanish Indian country. And while one encounters persons with Negro blood in such Gulf ports as Tampico or Veracruz, there is a true of Gulf and Caribbean port communities everywhere. What confronts us here is, in fact, a black republic in the heart of Mexico, a microcosm of Africa set down in the middle of Spanish, Aztec, Mayan, Zapotec culture. So purely African is this enclave that one is as unlikely to encounter whites, Indians, or Machismos within its boundaries as in such places as Accra or Lagos. How does this phenomenon affect the Mexican image? Civilized Americans, of course, reject the discredited stereotype of all Mexicans as peons slumbering in the sun. Such types do exist, but so does the Mexican who flashes credit cards, graduated from an American university, and jet to New York to clinch big deals. But the truly unknown Mexican, unknown, the writer discovers, to many Mexicans themselves is a man whose ethnic roots are African rather than Spanish and or Indian, and who lives in what is essentially an African community. Where is Afro Mexico? Geographically, it is a rectangular shaped area, 75 miles and 70 miles, 75 miles long and 15 miles wide, straddling the border between the two southern Pacific coast states of Guerrero and Oaxaca. It is bound on the south by the ocean and runs as far north as the half-ruined city of Omniptepic, once a gold mining center, but now fallen in decay. The African enclave's western extremity is the Guerrero village of Huahuaton. In the east, it stops at the mixed Afro Indian town of Pinotipa in Yaka or Azaka. Although smaller than Long Island, Afro Mexico offers an incredible diversity of topography and climate. Along the coast is a steaming tropical jungle region of mangrove swamps and coconut palms, but less than 5 miles inland, you find yourself on a plateau among the approaches to the towering Sierra Madre del Sur. This is cattle country, sparsely tread and enjoying a temperate climate characteristic of the African veldt. Africa is Africa in miniature. So you're having a population of an African culture who has built this community, has brought their traditions right there in a place about the size of Long Island. Go to the seaside village, and you're on the tropical Guinea coast. If you go to this place right here, Teko Inapa, they say you're on the tropical Guinea coast. It resembles the exact look topography of Guinea. Then travel less than 15 miles to the hill town of Chopon, and you find yourself in the invigorating uplands of Kenya. As interesting as the area's geography is in its history, how is it that a community of Negro Africans come to be found in Mexico? Hmm. The enclave's inhabitants are descendants of Negroes who escaped from a fleet of contraband slave ships bound for Acapulco during colonial times. Under laws of the Spanish crown, Veracruz was the only port authorized to receive slave shipments. But a number of illegal attempts were made to smuggle Negroes in Acapulco. So the next time any of you decide you want a vacation to Acapulco, I would strongly suggest that you hopefully and safely remove yourself from the resorts and of your pleasures and really begin trying to tap into the history of Acapulco, and you will see right here a strong African influence. Acapulco, now an international resort, but then New Spain's chief Pacific port, serviced the gold mining center of Ometepic and San Luis Acatlan. And it was believed that Negroes were harder than Indians and better suited for back-breaking labor in the mines. This is true. We're going to get into that in just one bit. The fugitive slaves, to their great good fortune, found themselves in a terrain almost identical to their homelands. Taking to the hills and swamps, they waged intermittent guerrilla warfare against soldiers of the Spanish vassals sent out to capture them. We're talking about now your Maroons. This state of affairs continued until Mexico achieved its independence in 1810 and all slaves were free. So, slaves were free in Mexico 55 years before America. The Africans remained unmolested until the latter part of the 19th century when they were herded into settlements by a German American adventurer from Pittsburgh named Johann Smith. Smith, who called himself Don Juan Smith in Mexico, ruled over the area as a local tyrant until he was overthrown by the Revolution of 1910. With the downfall of Smith, the Negroes set up a virtually self-governing community, and this is the situation that prevails to this day. Before we even go that far, you also have a man by the name of Vicente Guerrero, who was the second president of Mexico, who was Afro Matismo. He, being half African and half Spanish, helped free an Indian, helped he became the second president of Mexico, and then he also abolished slavery. And in his short period of time of living, of doing that, they later on overthrew him and assassinated him in 1831. All right? So he says here, although the western border of Afro Mexico is less than 100 miles from Acapulco, the enclave's existence is virtually unknown to the tourist throngs that invade the resort, meaning no one goes to do any type of discovery there. They just go on vacation. and have no idea that Mexico had a huge population of African influence. That's why, if you look at some of the dancing in Mexico, or what they call bailando, you'll see that much of their dancing and some of their songs were invented from West Africans. At the present time, a modus vivendi exists between the Mexican government and the local authority in the region, with the tacit understanding that federal intervention is kept at a minimum. To make one point perfectly clear, the African enclave can in no way be described as a ghetto or a segregated area. Mexico is free of racial discrimination, and persons who choose to leave the area are absorbed into Mexican life at every level, including intermarriage. Those who remained do so voluntarily and out of preference to their own way of life. Now, we know and understand there are some issues of racism in Mexico, but by and large, historically, Mexico was very in favor of having slaves or anyone of African descent there prior to racism rearing its naked head and revamping what we see as modern racism and discrimination with anyone of African descent. Not all, but there's a large portion of it. Due to the factors of geographical and cultural isolation, estimates vary as to Afro-Mexico's present population. So in that particular community, there is no racism. There is no discrimination. You have people of African descent, Indians or whoever is Spanish descent, getting along just perfectly fine. And it was well organized and it was well governed. The most widely accepted figure is 20,000, excluding persons of mixed Negro Indian or Negro Spanish blood who are found all along Costa Chica, a coastal strip running 200 miles between Acapulco and Puerto Angel. Okay? Well, let me say that one more time. The most widely accepted figure is 20,000, excluding persons of mixed Negro Indian or Negro Spanish. And mind you, this article was written in 1965, and he's been doing research on it for quite some time. So you can only imagine how heavily populated it was. He goes on to say, I have mentioned the amazing diversity of topography and climate that exists within the minuscule areas. No less striking is the diversity of one encounters among its inhabitants, affirming the principle that personality is developed by environment rather than by such a nebulous concept as race. Afro-Mexicans can be broken down in three distinct subcultures: urban, coastal, and mountain. So now you are just being identified by what? Geography, location, not race. The urban group consists of people born and raised in the area who have since chosen to join the mainstream of Mexican life. Such integration has meant pulling up stakes and moving into the big city, the metropolis, in this case being Acapulco. Negroes, mulattoes, and lobos, persons of mixed Negro and Indian ancestry, formed a considerable percentage of the resort's indigenous population, and the African influence creates an ambience completely atypical of Mexico, one that suggests Rio or Havana far more than Mexico City or Guadalajara. For all you people who are of Mexican descent, it is very imperative that you really become not only the students of your own history, but you may have to start setting aside your emotion and understand that the grandmother in the closet, at one point in time, one out of every four families in Mexico had an African grandmother. In fact, I can go so far to say It's really not a such thing what we call Mexican until you have a mixture of so many people coming together to create what we now call as Mexico. The majority of these displaced Negroes live in hillside communities on the outskirts of town, and some of these areas, like Lalaha or Cala Ocho, recall the fabulous of Black Orpheus. The African influence is also reflected in Acapulco's music and typically Mexican ranchero songs, while still popular, are, are given a strong run for their money by such Afro Carib rhythms as the merengue or pucacha or pachanga. Those are the forms of music that is African influence with Indians and some Spanish. So your origin of your music is coming out of what, Africa? Just like when you start getting into your other parts of the Caribbean, like Puerto Rico and Cuba. Presence of a strong Negro strain among Acapulcanos invariably that creates confusion among tourists. Where do you come from? This is a question I have had thrown at me repeatedly, and my explanation has usually been greeted with utmost skepticism. The idea of a Negro Mexican defies the American and European stereotype, and I have heard Afro Acapulcanos explained as Cuban refugees, Afro Americans, West Indians, visiting Africans, and in fact, as just about anything but what they actually are. Of the Afro Mexicans, you have remained in their homeland. The coast people inhabited a number of fishing villages like Tocanapa and Guerrero and Corello and Azaka. I'm not for sure how to pronounce this word, but like I said, forgive me, okay? And you can look these words up too in these locations. Terrain here resembles not only the West African littoral, but such trans Pacific locations as Fiji and New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, where the inhabitants, though non African, are of Negroid stock. The coastal Negroids are skilled swimmers and divers, and of ones who eventually make the move to Acapulco. Many wind up as professional skin divers and water ski instructors. Yet a few miles inland, you won't find one man in 100 that can swim a stroke. But it is in the hill folk of Afro Mexico who will mostly who will most actively stir the imagination of the lost civilization enthusiast. For the land they inhabit furnishes daily a drama recalling the American Wild West, complete with ranches, brandings, roundups, and even occasional range wars. But if the area is isolated, it is far from impoverished as it contains some of the best grazing country and finest herds in the Republic. Such prosperity is reflected in the overall economy in the small town of this one right here. I am not going to try to pronounce this word. It's too long, and I'm tired of making a fool of myself. Okay? With less than 5,000 population, was 3 movie houses and an airport, and fully electrified. For a community that size, this is almost unprecedented in Mexico. Another striking similarity between the region and our old frontier relates to the views on crime. In these uplands, there are only two unforgettable offenses: rustling and stealing horses. Law breaking of a non bovine or equine nature is dealt with, whenever possible, by the victim's family, with police strongly discouraged from intervening. But rustlers and horse thieves are handled over by quick trial before courts that met out a merciless justice. For example, the Huahuatin girl of my acquaintance, and we're going to go over this shortly, okay? We're going to get to the history of this soon, okay? Regularly takes Friday afternoons off from work to visit her cousin in Acapulco City Jail. He is in the 6th year of the 15th year sentence with the sure prospect of having to serve out his full term. This offense was too serious to warrant consideration of pardon or even parole. I inquired into the nature of his crime, and it was told that he had been convicted of stealing stolen butcher's meat. So they didn't play with that type of crime. But further on into this article, regardless of the environmental differences, both the amphibious coastal people and the herdsmen in the hills have in common a number of uniquely African folkways. On the coast, as in the mountains, village huts are circular shaped, constructed of wattle, and topped by thatched roofs. Both coastal and mountain women carry loads and baskets on their heads. This accounts for magnificent posture of Afro Mexican girls and babies are carried African style astraddle the mother's hip. Indian women, on the other hand, carry babies in the rebozo or a shawl. So you can see the culture. This is why I always trusted people who want to talk about the African influence and who was here and who wasn't. You got to look at culture and how people was even dealing with their children. They're clearly showing that two different groups of people had a particular way on how they will carry their child. The African woman would straddle her baby on the hip, whereas the Indian woman would carry it in a shroud. Those are those some of the key things that you have to pick up on when studying this history. The enchanting world of Afro Mexico provides interest for Afro Americans of a wide variety of tastes and backgrounds. For the travel writer, it is a untapped gold mine. Um, Out of curiosity, I scanned every guidebook on Mexico I can get my hands on and encountered only one, the revised edition of Terry's Guide to Mexico, and that even mentions the region. Hmm. The Negro Enclave is also an anthropologist's dream, and budding Ashley Monteeks and Margaret Meads, as they cover the area, will find source material to fill a score of scholarly monographs. If any remained unconvinced, I make the following suggestions. On their next trip to Acapulco, let them invest $16 the round trip. This is a 1965, okay? Round trip per passenger, price of a small charter plane, and visit either this city right here, Guerrero, or Santo Domingo, or this city right here, okay? Both communities serviced by airfields. Then let them say that Mexico has no lost civilization. And of course, at the end of the article, he states that here's a little bit. Jim Tuck, author of Afro Mexicans, is a freelance writer who makes his home within commuting distance of the villages described in the article. So he lives there. This is Mr. Tuck's second appearance in the Negro Digest this year, and the other article being Rome's Negro Empire in the Negro History issue in February. Now, so what are we saying? In this short article, and we're not done yet, okay, guys? So please be with me. In this short article, the writer of the article is touching bases on there is an African presence in Mexico that we're not speaking on. Enslaved Africans were brought to Mexico in large numbers by the Spanish, during which time Mexico utilized the African slave labor during the colonial period, especially in Spanish cities as domestic workers, artisans, and laborers in the textile. The origin of slaves is known throughout the documents, such as transcripts of sales, mainly coming from Cape Verde, Guinea, and Angola. Because of the decline of the indigenous population due to diseases, the demand for African slaves came between 1580 and 1640. Contracts, or asientos, between the Spanish crown and the private slavers were created to bring Africans to Spanish colonies. The slaver made deals with the Portuguese who controlled the African slave trade. Mexico had important slave ports in the New World. In the 17th century, the population outnumbered the enslaved population. Creoles and mulattoes occupied the legible social presence in Mexico by 1600. The scholar Herman Benet stated, in the same century, Mexico was the home to the most diverse black population in America. However, that created a slave resistance. Slave trade rebellion occurred in Mexico. In 1537, Cimarrones who were runaway slaves fled to the highlands between Veracruz and Puebla, and many made their way to Costa Chica. They formed settlements called palenques, which would fight off Spanish authorities. Gaspar Yanga was an African leader of a maroon colony of slaves in the highlands near Veracruz, Mexico. It was under Spanish colonial rule. They successfully resisted the Spanish in 1609, and he and the Maroons raided the Spanish settlements. In 1618, Yanga and the government came to an agreement that the Maroons could be self-ruled, later called San Lorenzo de los Negros. In the 19th century, he was named the National Hero of Mexico, and in 1932, the settlement located in what we now call Veracruz Province was named Yanga in his honor. Vicente Guerrero was an Afro mestizo descent, someone as a Mexican who have predominantly African heritage, Americans, and Spanish European. He fought against Spain for independence in the early 19th century. He became president on April the 1st, 1829. Not only calling for public schools and land title reform and trade development, as a liberal, he ordered an immediate abolition of slavery on September the 16th, 1829. This decision mostly affected Anglo-American slave-holding Southerners in the Mexican state of Texas. He is a Mexican national hero. The state of Guerrero is named after him.